Following the Golden Rule with Andrew Faas is proudly supported by RE/MAX St. Andrews. Live and vacation by the sea. Choose wisely. Choose RE/MAX.
Hello, my name is Andrew Faas, and welcome to Following the Golden Rule.
And I'm your co-host, Jay Remer. And for 26 weeks, Andy and I will be discussing the ABCs of building character. We're partway through the series, and we appreciate the comments and questions that have been posed on our Facebook and LinkedIn pages. Today, we're going to be talking about F is for fair. So, Andy, what do you, how do you define fair in today's context?
Well, in any context, fair is fair. And in today's context, what we're discovering is that there's been a lot of pent-up anger and fear and frustration, and that's being manifested by the protest we're seeing, and a lot of it led by the Black Lives Movement. But what we are discovering is the anger and fear goes beyond the narrative that we're seeing on TV or reading in the news. And the narrative is that the majority of people feel that they have been treated unfairly. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think we need to get a bit more granular and go beyond the way it's being interpreted. And I can speak to it very directly in terms of the workplace and the environment that where people spend the bulk of their waking hours. And the unfairness has been covered up, I guess, in so much that people are afraid to express their emotions relative to how they are perceived at work.
Well, I know that in your first book, The Bully's Trap, you used several stories that illustrate exactly how that unfairness evolves and how clever leadership has been in creating an unfair atmosphere. And so I'm wondering if you would like to speak to that at all.
Well, I can only speak to it in so much relative to what I put in the book on comparing a command and control system versus a more collaborative system. Mm-hmm. And through Mental Health America and through the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, we peel the onion back a bit in terms of how people feel about working in those kind of environments, and it talks directly to fairness. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to read off just a short list of our findings relative to that. So in North America, Canada, and the U.S., only 17% feel that their employee often or always appropriately deals with a coworker coworkers who are not doing their jobs. 17%. Mm-hmm. And is that fair or unfair?
Yeah, right.
Only 27% feel that employees are often or always held accountable for their work regardless of their position in the organization. 77% feel that people are being unfairly recognized, while others with better experience or skills don't get recognized. Mm-hmm. Less than 30% feel that their organization has realistic expectations about their workload. And statistic I've been always using, only 36% feel that their supervisor often or always supports them when things go wrong. Mm-hmm. So when you look at these statistics, all this does is spells unfairness. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is based on bias, mm-hmm. or nepotism, or just plain laziness. Uh-huh. But it's resulted in people feeling that they've been bad done by. Mm-hmm. So we're going into a new economic era. Mm-hmm. And the new economic era, unless it represents that fundamental ingredient of fairness, mm-hmm. we will have even more open revolt. Mm-hmm.
Well, back in 1976, there was a UN ratification for the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And we've discussed this in the show. We've mentioned it a couple of times. And it's something that I think we can agree on is not well understood or appreciated by most people, certainly in North America. And so I'm wondering, how do we address those rights? How can we force government to actually follow through on those rights, and how can we hold them accountable to that? Other than the ballot box, maybe that's the way.
Well, obviously the ballot box is the way to go. Mm-hmm. But even more importantly, it's and this is where our various characteristics are so interrelated. Mm-hmm. Like last week we talked about emotional intelligence, mm-hmm. with the message being we want people to make emotionally intelligent decisions versus emotional ones. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing a lot of emotional decisions being made. Mm-hmm. And some of it is destroying the monuments or other looting activities. We are seeing a lot of focus on renaming buildings, and that is public pressure, mm-hmm. and that is causing that. We are calling for police reform and the end of police brutality. So you can tear down every monument, you can change every name of every institution, and you can totally reform police, and hopefully that does stop the police brutality. Mm-hmm. But it will not fix how the majority of people feel.
Right.
And what needs fixing is the entire system, mm-hmm. and pretty much every institution in the system. Mm-hmm. What you were talking about relative to the rights, what people can do is be clearer in terms of what they are protesting against. Mm-hmm. And what they are what people should be protesting against is the denial of the rights that are entrenched and that our country's committed to in 1976. Mm-hmm. And it's the right to work in just and favorable conditions. Mm-hmm. The right to social protections. The right to an adequate standard of living. The right to the highest standards of health, and the right to education and cultural benefits. Mm-hmm. These rights, as I indicated in the introduction, do not come from a socialist manifesto. And it comes from an international covenant of economic, social, and cultural rights, which were ratified by our countries, Canada and the U.S., in 1976. And as I indicated in the introduction, people do not understand or believe that these are rights that they are entitled to and have been denied. And this is what they should be angry about. If they realize that they have these rights, and because they're not being denied these rights, means they are being treated unfairly. So in our rebuilding of an economy and a new social order, this has got to be the foundation for that rebuilding. And that's not going to be advanced by the lobbyists that our politicians listen to more than people. It's got to be advanced by people saying, this is my right.
Yes.
And I'm being demanded it. And what we're falling into a trap of having to choose extremes with the polarization that exists. And we're either going to go way far left into a total dictatorship or autocratic system, or we're going to go way far right if people get so fed up that there will be civil or a cultural war, which arguably we're in right now, versus convalescing around the middle. And the middle is basing a socio-economic model on rights and giving everybody, as Abraham Lincoln says, fairness.
Yes.
Fairness for everyone. And that's what our economy should be built at. And everyone can play a role in that. Now, it doesn't take an academic researcher to tell us that these rights are being denied to a majority of people in our countries. And we should be, politicians should be paying more attention to people and the people's demands to turn this from rhetoric to reality.
Right.
And it all gets back to the unfairness of it. So is it fair for the white, privileged male to control the agenda for everybody else?
Yeah.
And yes, the focus has been on Black Lives Matter, but we also got to focus on all of the unfairness and injustices that are built into our system.
There's been a lot of comments on social media lately that against the rich and powerful, and it crosses lots of different topics. But you know, it occurs to me that there are going to be rich and powerful people, but they could use that power in quite a different way that would benefit society and address these basic human rights. It's not like you're asking that these rights are not extraordinary. They're very basic, and everyone should be entitled to these things. And I think
not should be. Everybody is entitled to it.
Everybody is entitled, but everybody isn't subject to them.
Yeah, and I've gone beyond trying to convince, you know, it's the capitalist system that either will survive this or won't. And I think more than a push is needed. They did not fix it after the last financial meltdown. Appealing to that small group is futile.
Yeah.
I think it's something that has to be forced either through legislation or forced through the shareholders who will say we're not going to invest in the company unless they fulfill a social responsibility and address this whole issue of unfairness and injustice that exists within most institutions. Abraham Lincoln, I think, got it right in terms of how he based his presidency, and he was a great advocate for public sentiment, and for him it was everything. And he didn't listen to the lobbyist. He went out and listened to the people. And what he heard was these men asked for just the same thing: fairness, and fairness only. This, so far is in my power, they and all others shall have. And the emphasis, they and all others shall have.
Yeah.
So when we become discriminatory in terms of being fair, then we become unfair. So when we say we need to change the people at the top, I still believe that it starts from the individual, and on the premise that everybody can be a leader,
right?
And truly ask themselves, am I fair with the people who I have various relationships with? Am I being fair to my children? And a lot of people misinterpret fairness and say, you know, we've got to treat everybody equally. And there's a real differentiation between being equal and equality. And equality is where people get a fair share of the pie, whatever that pie is.
Right.
And that's, you know, we can overthink this, but we should overthink it in ourselves.
Yes.
And then once we figure it out in ourselves, to say, you know, remember back, and I've done it this way, is I look at situations where I've been unfairly treated. And being part of the LGBT community, I have certainly been discriminated against. And the way I have thought it through over the years is I can either complain about that or protest against that, or be an example of someone who makes fairness a foundational piece in terms of who I am in the decisions I have to make. And hopefully that will influence others.
Well, I think in you know, it's a good analysis for us to all go through, because if we think of the times when we've been treated unfairly, and we think about how that made us feel, and if we follow that along the path of the golden rule and say, when I treat people unfairly, how do they feel? It begins to make more sense individually, because I think you're right. I think it is within each of us that we have to make the transformation. And I'm thinking that in this culture of fear that we live in, it tends to push people more towards, and I think this is, proven out, more towards making emotional decisions, which tend to be unfair.
Emotionally intended.
No, I think it pushes.
In reverse, yes.
Yeah, I think that this culture of fear pushes us towards making more emotional decisions, which, by definition, are unfair because they favor us. Because we want, we feel that there's lack, and we want as many beans as we can get, and so that's where the inequality comes and the lack of fairness.
Actually, this morning or yesterday, the RBC Bank made a great announcement. We're going to make sure that our board has at least 30% minority representation. Well, it's 2020 already. Why wasn't that declared 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And so the first thing when I'm talking to organizational leaders about it is find out how many people trust your HR department, and if it's under 70%, get rid of him or her, because they are a block to doing what is needed to create a better culture in your environment. And the boards of governors or directors of organizations should be demanding of their CEO and C-suite executives to create a system that truly is representative of the entire community. And that people are treated in a fair and just manner. But right now, it's pretty evident that people in HR have kind of codified and institutionalized an unfair and unjust environment.
Well, I mean, the HR department is, I guess initially the idea was that it was to represent the employees and their complaints and so forth, and it's now not. It's working for the leaders, and they skew things so that people who actually have legitimate gripes won't go to them with them, because they know that they're not going to be treated in a fair way and get a fair hearing.
Well, I think it does go beyond that, and the system is rigged, really, against the employee in this case is one of the stakeholders, and it's rigged in so much that even if a person is brave enough to lodge a complaint, then that complaint goes to an arbitration, and the whole system of arbitration is skewed in the employer's favor. It cannot be appealed. It's very difficult to appeal, and it must be kept secret.
Yeah.
And that is unfair. So there's another example of being unfair.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, I think that there's an appetite out there for there to be more of a voice from the shareholder to put the pressure on management of the companies, as you suggested earlier. Well, if you don't, because I've talked to people, I've talked to young investors specifically asking that question, how do you feel about this? And they all say, we feel strongly about it. So I think that there is an appetite for this change.
Amongst individual investors, yes. I don't think it's there yet with the institutional investors.
Oh, okay.
And again, we're looking at a stock market that defies, the reality as to what's going on in the economy. I'm no economist, but I know that the gap is wide and growing wider and will grow wider and will grow wider. And at some point, something's got to give. Either we can quickly fix what's broken out there and create this more just and fair environment, or it's going to collapse. And I'm not at all confident yet that we can do this in the kind of time that it has to be done.
Yeah. Well, Andy, I think that it's that's all important, and I think it gives us a chance to ask people to really go back and do some self reflection, and to ask themselves how they view themselves as being fair, how other people would view them, especially people who they hold in high esteem. Would they view you as being fair? And then how do you view other people as being fair? I think these are all important questions that need to be asked, and we will continue through this series to ask people to self-reflect on these things.
I'd add to what we're asking the audience to do, in so much that we've now gone through 6 of these episodes, but start interrelating and interconnecting them. And last week we dealt with E is for being emotionally intelligent, and got actually a lot of questions on that to say, can you say more on what emotional intelligence means? We will, as we go through, in terms of how to apply emotional intelligence. So it's first to recognize in yourself, how emotionally intelligent you are, and by becoming more emotionally intelligent, you can better regulate your own emotions. But more importantly, you can also start recognizing the emotional intelligence of others, or how people feel, and helping them regulate their emotions. Exactly. So that they make emotionally intelligent decisions versus emotional ones. But the beauty of going through all of the letters of the alphabet is how they can be interpreted differently by different people. And some will become more important than others.
And thank you for watching the show today, and we look forward to your questions and comments on our Facebook and LinkedIn pages, and we look forward to you joining us next week for G is for Grateful.
Following the Golden Rule with Andrew Faas is proudly supported by Remax St. Andrews. Live and vacation by the sea. Choose wisely. Choose Remax.